He expected quiet. Late flights meant empty houses, the hush of a place built to swallow sound. He had rehearsed the conversation in his head a dozen times on the overnight flight. The curt questions, the cutter answers, the way he would look at her as if he were reading a ledger and found a line item that didn't belong. The driveway was darker than he liked. The moon folded into the glass and chrome of the cars. He unlocked the front door with a key code he barely used anymore. The housekeeper handled doors, the assistant handled visitors, the world outside handled itself. He stepped into the foyer and the smell hit him. Warm tomato, garlic, the kind of bread that had been hand-shaped. Laughter echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, bright and uncontained. For a moment he froze because there are two kinds of loud in houses like his. One is the loud of music blaring through speakers positioned to make a statement. The other is the loud of voices that belong together, the kind of noise only people who care make. He walked toward it, toward the sound, toward the living room where, by the soft pool of lamplight, a scene unfolded that knocked the breath from him. The living room had been turned into a mini kitchen and dining hall. Folding tables, mismatched chairs, paper place settings, a big sign hand-painted and slightly crooked that read "Welcome Home." A dozen children, ages ranging from toddlers to teenagers, were clustered around the tables, coloring, arguing about who got the last piece of cake, comparing scars and sneakers with the candid brutality of kids who did not yet know to soften each other. At the center, carrying a tray of steaming bowls, was his wife. She was laughing with a boy who had a gap-toothed grin and an armful of toys rescued from a thrift store. She had flour on the back of her hand. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She turned when she heard the door. For one fraction of a second he saw the face of the woman he'd married, the curve of her jaw, the crease between her brows when she concentrated, and the woman he believed had become part of a corporate life that made statements the way his cars made statements. She surprised him by wiping her hands on her apron and walking toward him without the defensive posture he had learned to expect from the people who ran his social life. Always measured, always assessing. She stepped up to him and kissed him on the cheek, quick and unfussy. "You're back early," she said. He could have asked why. He could have asked why the living room was full of stray laughter and mismatched shoes. Instead he scanned the room and his eyes met the child who looked up as if searching for permission to speak. There was a quiet there that belonged to children who were used to being told to keep still. "What is all this?" he asked. "After-school program," she replied. "I thought we could host it here for a month while the community center gets repaired. They need the space and I thought," her voice softened, "I thought you would want to know. I signed the insurance for the extra coverage. I found volunteers. We have sandwiches from the kitchen and tutors from the university." He blinked. The world rearranged. His mind, a machine tuned to risk, found no immediate cost center. Then the cost center arrived. One of the teenagers, tall, a face sharpened by too many nights with too little to eat, approached him, clutching a folder. "Sir, I want to thank you for the grant," he said, voice steadier than the boy's hands. "My dad used to work in one of your plants. A month after he left, he got sick. We couldn't afford the medicine. Your foundation gave us a fund to help, and we wanted to say thank you." There was an ache in the billionaire's chest that was not unfamiliar. Profit margins and reputations had been his muses for years, but gratitude, real, unexpected gratitude, had toppled more than one balance sheet in his mind. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in a long time he noticed how tired she looked, how her eyes carried small creases that had nothing to do with their parties. He had been so busy building empires that he had allowed the map of his own house to be drawn without his input. He had not known this room could be used like this. A little girl climbed into his lap while he was still processing. She smelled like soap and oranges. Her fingers found the cuff of his sleeve, and she squeezed as if testing whether he would stay. "Will you read me the story?" she asked. He had a dozen people to call, appointments to reschedule. He had emails to write that would send men to places he had never visited. He had a calendar stitched so tight it hurt. He looked at the faces around him. A teacher brushing sauce from a boy's chin, volunteers folding napkins, teenagers organizing donation bags. There was a rhythm that had nothing to do with his board meetings and everything to do with one human choosing another human. "What does any of this have to do with me?" he asked suddenly, sharper than he intended. "She thought you should see what small things look like when you let them be big," the teenager answered, blunt and honest. "She says you made a big donation last year when you didn't want credit. It helped keep the soup kitchen open for the winter. And then she kept helping. She didn't tell you because she knew you were busy. There is a particular kind of silence that follows truth. It makes you aware of the muscles in your face, of the way your heart wants to call for the familiar defenses." He had been praised for decisions that needed praise. He had been vilified for decisions that needed explanations. He had learned to judge himself by the size of his holdings instead of the breadth of his hands. He stood and walked to the kitchen without saying much. There was a boy measuring flour with the serious face of an accountant. A woman he recognized from charity events was teaching embroidery to a girl who had never had a needle in her life. He watched his wife knead dough and press it into tins, smoothing the tops with thumbs that left fingerprints like signatures. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked again, gentler. She looked up, flour dusting her cheek like a constellation. "Because you'd say no on principle. You think big initiatives need a committee and a press release. You think of money as the first step. I thought the first step is to feed someone, teach them, let them be a kid. I thought if I started small, maybe you'd see that smallness matters." "Is this your rebellion?" he asked, trying on a joke so he wouldn't have to wear the admission. She laughed and shook her head. "No. It's my choice." A volunteer handed him a ladle as if challenging him to participate. He took it like someone accepting a dare. The ladle was warm. The steam rose and filled the space between him and the people around him. He scooped a bowl and carried it back to the table. A teenage boy accepted it with a nod. Simple. No ledger. No contract. He sat at the end of the table where the children didn't expect him to join and felt the odd sensation of being ordinary. Later, when the dishes were cleared by a chorus of clattering hands and the children were tucked into makeshift beds in the library and sunroom, he and his wife sat down on the back terrace. The city hummed beyond the hedges, a different sort of glow. She reached for his hand without waiting for him to offer it. "You could have told me sooner," he said. "I know," she said. "But I wanted you to come home early and see it without the announcement. I wanted you to feel the way I feel when I see them here. You give a lot of money, you change a lot of things, but you never see them cleaned up, you never see a kid fall asleep with a bowl in their hands and a full belly. I wanted you to see the people who are the faces of the numbers on your statements." He felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his public image. He had built a life on certainty, on plans wound tight enough to strangle doubt. Here, in a living room scattered with crayons and mismatched cups, doubt loosened its grip. "I thought about shutting it down," he admitted finally. "About the liability, the insurance, the disruption." She turned to him, a mild reproach in her expression. "You thought of the liability first." He laughed, a short embarrassed sound. "Old habits." They sat in the comfortable hush that had nothing to do with the deal-making quiet of boardrooms. He thought of the families who had received checks and never met the hands that wrote them. He thought of the plant managers who balanced budgets against human faces and lost sleep for reasons that didn't make it into quarterly statements. He thought of the first time he had watched a man sign his name on a mortgage and realized his signature had the power to call things into existence. "You don't have to change everything," she said softly. "Just come home more often." "It's not that simple," he said. "Nothing about the rest of your life is simple," she said. "But this can be. For 1 hour, for one night, you can be a neighbor instead of a CEO. You can be a man who serves soup and reads a story and listens to a kid talk about his math homework. You can be present. It doesn't mean your other choices vanish. It just fills the space between them." He found himself remembering a boy who had once sat in his lap years ago, a nephew maybe or a neighbor's child, the edges of memory blurred by years of late nights and early flights. The memory was small and stubborn, like the seed of a plant under a stone. He had once loved a version of himself that could be soothed by someone's small hand. He wondered when he had let that version go. Over the next hour, he read a story about a fox who lost his way and found his courage. The children's eyes widened at the fox's tricks. They fell asleep halfway through, their heads on soft arms, blanket sharing as if it were the only natural thing in the world. He watched them and felt his heart unclench a fraction. The next morning he woke before sunrise, not from a meeting alert but from the quiet of a house where children were still asleep. He walked through the rooms and found notes on the fridge, thank you cards, crayon drawings, a stack of applications for volunteers. There was a sign-up sheet with his name on it at the bottom, not because he had written it, but because someone had penciled him in the night before, perhaps guided by his wife's gentle insistence. He spent the day differently. Calls were taken at odd moments, emails replied to with instructions that surprised his team. He visited the volunteer coordinator and signed a form. He sat with the teenagers and listened to their plans to start a coding club. He approved a small grant but demanded oversight, not because he wanted control, but because he wanted to see results with his own eyes. People noticed. The press, hungry for any deviation in his public persona, sniffed for scandal or spin. Friends asked if his sudden interest was a PR stunt. He answered with a simplicity that unsettled them, "I went home early." When the local news called, she told them he had returned to the living room. It made a headline for a day. They called it a redemption story. He allowed them the first draft and held the rest in his hands.